As we all know, this is a critical moment for unions in general, but more particularly for public sector unions. The original impetus for tonight's event was, of course, the dramatic turn of events that took place in Wisconsin earlier this year. But when we look at this issue a little bit more closely, we can see that the erosion of public sector collective bargaining rights actually has a much longer history, both in the US and here in Canada. So as we've seen in some very recent high-profile labor disputes, the government intervention into the collective bargaining process exists everywhere, and here in Canada in particular right now. So this is a very timely event, and we're very fortunate to have a panel of experts here with us tonight to provide us with some insight into what's going on and what perhaps we can expect in the future. So let me introduce my panelists. I'll start with Elaine Bernard. Elaine is the Executive Director of the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Trade Union Program. She was born and raised in Canada and has a BA from the University of Alberta, an MA from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD from Simon Fraser. A lifelong union member and activist, Elaine brings a refreshing balance of humor and passion for workers' rights to her talks and teaching. She's conducted courses on a wide variety of topics for unions, community groups, universities, and government departments. Her current research and teaching interests are in the area of international comparative labor movements, union leadership and governance, and the role of unions in promoting civil society, democracy, and economic growth. So, welcome, Elaine. Next we have Bob Hebdon. Bob joined McGill's Faculty of Management in 2000, and after graduating from U of T with an MA in Economics in 1968, he worked for OPSU for 24 years. He completed his PhD in IR at the Center for IR at U of T in 1992 and began his academic career at Cornell, where he taught collective bargaining for 7 years at the School of Industrial Relations. So currently he's the program chair for the Industrial Relations major in the Faculty of Arts at McGill. And he's won the prestigious Morley Gunderson Prize at the University of Toronto in 2007 for his outstanding contributions to industrial relations. So welcome. Next we have Elizabeth Shilton. Elizabeth is currently the Law Foundation of Ontario Senior Fellow at Queen's University's Centre for Law in the Contemporary Workplace. She's a founding partner of Cavaluso, Hayes, Shilton, McIntyre, and Cornish, a Toronto-based law firm specializing in union-side labor law, and has practiced there for many years, advising and litigating both public and private sector union clients. So she's recently taught courses in labor, employment, and collective bargaining law at University of Toronto, York University, and McMaster. She's been the visiting scholar at Osgood Institute for Feminist Legal Study as well. Elizabeth holds an LLM from Harvard and an SJD from the University of Toronto. Her current research interests focus on employment pension policy and related issues of economic security. So welcome, Elizabeth. And last but not least, we have Sam Gindin. Sam spent most of his working career, 27 years in fact, in the CAW as research director and then assistant to Presidents Bob White and Wes Hargrove. After retiring, Sam became the Packer Chair in Social Justice at York University. So welcome, Sam. Okay, so the way we're going to proceed is I'm going to actually ask some questions to the panelists, to an individual panelist. And once the panelist has given their thoughts, I'm going to open it up for anybody else who wants to add anything on that, and then we'll move forward that way. After that, I'll open up the floor for the audience to ask their questions. I'm sure we all have a lot to ask of the panelists as well. Okay, so my first question is for Elaine. So can you just provide us with a bit of context in terms of the origins of what's been going on and what are the driving factors behind it?
Okay, well, the main factor that people draw on this is the 2008 Great Recession, which, as you know, was brought on by the meltdown of the financial sector in the U.S. and spread not only from the U.S. but indeed internationally into a recession that certainly in the U.S. we are still totally involved in, with unemployment, official unemployment still hovering around 10%. And of course, this recession led to a budget crisis in state and local government, or actually exacerbated an existing budget crisis. We should be clear where that budget crisis came from. It was basically a combination of this Bush era and continued on by the Obama administration. Bush-era tax cuts, massive tax cuts, which, by the way, went to the highest income bracket overwhelmingly. So a combination of these tax cuts, along with tremendous government expenditure in running 2 wars. And these 2 factors really squeezed out, put a huge pressure on the federal government, which then cut back on transfers to the states and provoked a growing state problem. Well, the 2008 recession really provided a political opportunity. And it was an opportunity that was a long time in coming. We have a number of right-wing think tanks and organizations which are very well networked in the United States. 2 in particular, the State Policy Network, which was founded in 1992, which has organizations loosely affiliated, but in most states, that have come up with legislation that they believe will, further weaken unions, the public sector, etc. And then another group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, Gindin, that actually writes model legislation for legislators, which is aimed at weakening labor. So with the political opportunity, we saw with new legislators coming in at the beginning of 2011, a real assault against unions and public employees, the like of which we just haven't seen in the U.S. even in any time in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And it's sort of a little puzzling because if you think about it, union density in the U.S. has sunk below 12%. The private sector is now below 7% union density. Of course, the union story in the U.S. right now is the public sector, at about 36, 37% union density. And in fact, in states with bargaining rights, it's much higher, closer to 40%. So this attack and assault on organized labor at the level of the states brought in a whole pile of legislation. First, it was blaming the unions and public employees, scapegoating them. You had a lot of people distressed, who to blame? Well, we're running out of people to blame. We can't blame socialists. We're tired of blaming African Americans. We still like to blame immigrants, but, a really good group to scapegoat was, in fact, the public employees and the unions. And of course, it forced the unions, from a political point of view, to spend down the revenues, threw them back on their heels, onto the defensive, spending down their funds in face of what's going to be a presidential election next year, the 2012 election. It instilled fear in activists and in union members, and the idea was to permanently weaken unions, especially in the public sector, which is, of course, where states legislate. And it resulted in a number of states, either the elimination or the abolition of collective bargaining, and this whole view that collective bargaining is some sort of privilege that's granted and that can be given or taken away. Legislation that seeks to make it harder for unions to collect dues from their members, legislation that makes it much harder to organize, and in fact in some states requiring unions to recertify their members every year, and really to try and instill fear, and ultimately to acquire a very lucrative revenue stream, if you think about this, because it opens the door to more privatization, a public revenue stream for the private sector, and bypassing and ignoring democracy. Some of the legislation has led to emergency powers for managers that allows them to ignore not only collective agreements, but in fact previously existing safeguards So it's been quite an onslaught, but it's not an accident, it's not new. It's well orchestrated, well organized, and has been, it's using the financial crisis as an opportunity.
So given this sort of context about what's been going on, what have been the reactions of the various parties that have been affected by these changes? So for example, we know obviously unions, but also the public and others.
Yeah, it's a good question, Rupert. Let me just say that I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer a different question first.
Okay.
I'm going to change the script, if you forgive me. I just wanted to, I thought it would be useful, since we're talking about Madison, Wisconsin, to kind of outline the collective bargaining regime that was offered by this Tea Party governor that was elected, Walker. For a lot of you people here are either in collective bargaining, have been in collective bargaining, or they study collective bargaining. I know some of the faces here. Here's the collective bargaining regime that he was offering to public employees in the state of Wisconsin. Police and fire, untouched. Now, this is a libertarian ideology at work here. The only public services they believe in are protection of property. So fire and police are untouched, completely predictable. Secondly, state and local and pretty much everybody else. Okay, everybody else. It kind of looks okay at first blush. It says wage bargaining only. There has to be he's legislating a higher contribution for both health care and pensions. And I think we'll come back to that point later on in this, because that's an important element to this story, I think, unfolding story. But here's the but, and I think it's a huge one. No checkoff of dues. So unions have to collect the dues person by person. And it's voluntarily revocable, which means it can be stopped anytime by an individual who just feels like, no, I don't feel like paying this month. I'm going to stop paying. Well, if they're paying it directly to the union, that's going to happen that way. But that's in the legislation. Secondly, there must be a secret ballot every year on whether or not to have a union. So if you're going to have a union, you have to have a secret ballot vote every year to confirm this. There must be an affirmation of the union every year. And of course, the people who don't want to pay dues are encouraged not to pay dues in various ways. You must negotiate every year. And wages are tied to the CPI, whatever that is. I mean, the consumer price index, depending on whatever that is. We know what it is. Unless you can get higher wages if you're prepared to win a referendum on higher wages. So that's the collective bargaining regime that they were offered. Saying this isn't, from where I come from, that's not collective bargaining. So, we'll be hearing a lot about this, but massive protests. The unions did, and this sort of answers your question, I think. The unions did a superb job of mobilizing. And it wasn't just mobilizing around the loss of benefits, the increased pension contributions and healthcare contributions and the losses. Clearly it was mobilization around the loss of rights, collective bargaining rights. And I spent a lot of time looking at YouTube videos of this because I wasn't there. And almost every interview, they talked about the loss of bargaining rights as the issue, the key issue. So that it was framed as a rights issue right from the very beginning. 10,000 people initially, 50,000. The police admitted in the final big demonstration they had that there were over 100,000. Well, if the police admitted there were over 100,000, you can double that or triple that, whatever. It was incredibly large. The largest demonstrations, and there was a very cold day. There's a nice picture of the whole Wisconsin legislative building there, and the grounds around it looked like Queen's Park here. It was covered, and it was snow and people. That's all you could see, everywhere. So they did a fantastic job of mobilizing. One of the things that I was kind of interested in, and I thought I'd share it with you, was I went back and I looked at all of the polls that were taken around that time. I tried to get all of them. That was impossible. Everybody was polling. But I kind of summarized them all, and I thought I'd share them with you. This gives you an idea of the public reaction. So we've got the union reaction. And the union also got involved in political action with a number of, I forget the number of senators left the state, made it difficult for the legislation to get through because they weren't present, they couldn't get a quorum. So Walker had trouble getting these delinquent Democratic senators to come back and vote in the legislature and make the law official. And by the way, in the polls, that wasn't a very popular move for them. The public didn't like that. They didn't like their senators leaving, at least the Wisconsin polls. They didn't like their senators leaving the Democrats. Took a bit of a hit on that one. But overall, these are some of the findings that I found. First of all, I'll start with the Wisconsin picture first. The national picture is fairly straightforward. First of all, there's a number of polls on the recall elections that are, as far as I know, they're still underway. You must get, as you know, enough signatures to get a recall election in play. And there are 8 recall elections in play. Some pollster in Wisconsin did a detailed poll of the prospects of these people losing. Would you vote against them? Sort of questions. If there were an election held, and I would say, you know, as the analysts showed, 3 or 4 of them were in trouble. Now, I don't know if that's sustaining over time. I don't know if it's possible. I know one thing about the Wisconsin recall process, unlike California, you have to have a candidate to vote for, an alternative candidate. There has to be a Democratic candidate on the ballot that you vote for. You can't just get rid of somebody and then have nothing. You have to actually vote for another person. So they're going to have to get some good Democratic alternative candidates. And if they can do that, it's conceivable that they might actually unseat a number of these Tea Party senators that voted for this legislation, and who knows, this whole thing could unravel. That's sort of an iffy thing, but it's a possibility that could happen out of this event. In terms of support for Governor Walker in the state of Wisconsin, 42% of the population in most of the polls sided with unions, 31% supported the governor. This is after he's just been elected, this governor. You know, that's a significant shift in support. I was interested in the breakdown of that support. Elaine talked about tax cuts for the rich. Guess what? The rich as defined as 90,000 or more, were the only group that supported it. And increasingly, as you go down the income groups, the lower income groups were 75% against Walker and 75% for union. So there's a class, obviously a class element to this. Also, a higher proportion of non-whites were supporting unions and opposing. One of the most encouraging things that I got from this, the age group that was most supportive was 18 to 29. Highest opposition in that group. Now, I went back to the protest again, and I looked at the protest, and I looked for young people in this protest. I don't know if anybody here was at Madison. I didn't see them. I know a former student of mine was there. I was doing a PhD at the center, actually. But I didn't see them there, but they were definitely supporting what was going on. But if this poll is accurate. On public approval rates, public employee approval rates in Wisconsin, 70% approval for healthcare workers and for teachers, which is pretty strong. Now, there is a limit to this. The public wanted concessions from public employees. That also comes through. They supported cuts to pensions, they supported healthcare cuts, and they supported temporary wage freezes. So it's not all one-sided here. But on the question of collective bargaining rights, they supported workers, and they supported unions, overwhelmingly, actually. In terms of the national polls, this is really interesting because a lot of citizens in the U.S. were asked, would you like this kind of reform in your state? Would you like to have this kind of attack that's going on rights? Would you like to have workers reduce their pensions and all? They asked all these detailed questions in various polls, from Gallup organizations to CBS, NBC, they all asked them. And almost all of them, and I'm just summarizing, I picked out one with the numbers, but they were all 60% against this kind of reform and about 33% for, which is about the national poll that you always get of support for unions. Gallup has been doing that poll since 1936. I have it in my textbook. And it's 60% every year. Roughly 60%. It's very flat, very long term. So this is the kind of, well, I just want to end with this, that there seems to be some potential here. I think if unions are able to continue the momentum that they build up in these protests, you know, they've been awakened somehow. They've been dormant in sleep, it seems, but they're definitely alive, and Madison showed that. And there is support in the rest of America for this. Americans want unions. They like unions, it seems. They're not anti-union. It's just the elites, the Bush, the conservative governments, and their legislative process, which